So thank you very much for your patience, and it's my pleasure to welcome all of you now back here in the plenary room for the concluding session of our conference, our annual conference of the Geneva Human Rights Platform, looking at human rights under pressure, reason to expand connectivity. This concluding panel discussion now is co-organized with the Geneva Graduate Institute and closes our 2024 annual conference. High-level representatives, who I will introduce in just a minute, from various UN agencies are invited to reflect upon where human rights are present in their mandates, policies, and programs, and what further input and guidance they would welcome from the human rights system. In the Pact for the Future, heads of states and governments recognize, it's a quote, that the multilateral system and its institutions, with the United Nations and its charter at the center, must be strengthened to keep pace with the changing world. They must be fit for the present and the future, effective and capable, prepared for the future, just, democratic, equitable, and representative of today's world, inclusive, interconnected, and financially stable. In particular, Action 46 addresses the strengthening of human rights inter alia by enhancing the coordination and cooperation among UN entities. Our panel will focus on that, and so it's my great pleasure to welcome here on the panel Ms. Nada Al-Nashif, Deputy High Commissioner for Human Rights of OHCHR, Mr. Thomas Lamanauskas, Deputy Secretary General of the ITU, Katharina Böhme, Assistant Director General of the WHO, Agi Verech, Director of the Geneva Representation Office of UNDP, and Arnold Kreilhuber, Regional Director of the Europe Office of UNEP. The panel was supposed to be co-moderated with my director, Professor Paula Gaeta, who sends her regrets. She is actually also sick, as was the very first speaker in this morning, so she's not able to join us. I'd like to thank Virginia Bras-Gomez, member of the advisory board of the Geneva Human Rights Platform, that she stepped in to co-moderate this session with me. And with this, I'd like to hand it over to you, Nada, please.
Thanks very much, Felix. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Apologies for the delay. I think I have 5 minutes, if I'm not docked a couple for being so late, but a little bit unavoidable this time of year with the calendar being what it is. But really a delight to be here with my fellow UN colleagues and all of you, and a very timely discussion. As always, a delight always to be with Virginia, whom we miss, but who remains a champion for social justice and all manner of rights wherever she is. And thank you, Felix, again for making the space open. Maybe just to kick off, maybe 3 messages from me. First of all, and it really is important that we have this discussion, this is a critical juncture. I don't think we can say it enough. We're talking about a pushback on all rights, very generally. We're talking about the unraveling of multilateralism, a wholesale, I would say, abdication of the rule of law, particularly international humanitarian law, international human rights law, and I think with unprecedented attacks on the United Nations, all that we stand for, and a blatant disregard, as I said, for all of the mechanisms, all of the independent experts, and all of the machinery. And so I think that, therefore, what we do in coming together is not just a question of an additionality, of a nicety, of a preference that we have among ourselves. It is a necessity, just as we urge you all to stay with this coalition. But I think it's very important here in Geneva, where we have a hub, where we can bring together the diplomats, the international cooperation, the technical work that we do, from health and trade to environment and to humanitarian work. This can indeed be a platform and a showcase for how, although we do everything that we do in parallel, with convergence, with complementarity, there is a common thread. We believe that glue that holds these pillars together is indeed human rights, and I hope you'll hear more from my colleagues to this form. Just from global health, the importance of equitable access to health care and addressing social determinants, to, in the case of environmental degradation, how important it is to have sustainable development practices, for example, ensuring public participation in decision-making. Message number 2, the challenges, as I said, are paramount. It is important that we do 2 things: uphold the principles without compromise, but also demonstrate resourcefulness, agility, and our ability to come up with smart solutions. The pushback is manifesting partly in a chronic underfunding, particularly of the human rights pillar. I know we would all say that we were underfunded. Certainly the humanitarians are horribly underfunded. I think globally humanitarian appeals are now hovering around 30% with huge discrepancies in what is actually in the pot. But we are a pillar, human rights, and we have about 5% of the UN's regular budget. And we can discuss why and how, but I think it's very important that therefore we really rely, all of us, on this fulfillment of mandate to protect and promote human rights across everybody else. How to do it? There are many places where we try to balance advocacy. I don't necessarily mean megaphone diplomacy, but I mean advocacy, which is targeted, which is strategic, which is forceful, with an ability to work in private and to engage. I think certainly the Office and the High Commissioner are fully committed to a very constructive engagement that does not compromise our voice, but that makes absolutely sure that we are dotting the I's and crossing the T's on everything, and making sure that we engage through dialogue, through capacity building, through training. Therefore, we have to look to our internal weaknesses. I'm still talking about challenges in the second headline, because we still have some inconsistencies, some inefficiencies in our own work, and perhaps some lost opportunities, which is the most important. And I think we need to look at these. I think the discrepancies really have to be removed. I think we have come together very powerfully over the past year on some of the most critical crises and messaging, but I think we can do more, particularly in strengthening engagement on human rights components of work. Of course, we had the common agenda, the UN common agenda, we had the call to action for human rights, and now we have the pact for the future. So moving forward, just to the third cluster of issues, the opportunities. I think the pact does integrate human rights commitments in a full display of their cross-cutting nature, which is very important, reiterating the equal importance. Again, this is an agenda which is indivisible, it is interconnected, it is universal in terms of its character, and we need a whole-of-system approach, which is the only way forward for all of us. We need, in addition to this dialogue, we need education. We need to make sure that we have more solidarity, including with the international cooperation systems. I hope that our UN colleagues continue to see the human rights system as resources that they can draw on, both for advice and expertise, but also in the enormous body of work that the treaty bodies, I see some members here, the treaty bodies, the special mechanisms, the independent experts, the special rapporteurs, and of course the work of the office itself, but the standards and the principles that we have cultivated over time that are a very significant bulwark. And we do insist that human rights offers solutions. And I think whether it is inequality or discrimination or conflict, the human rights lens, not the security lens, the human rights lens is critical to making sure that we can build that lasting peace and sustainable development that we're all working towards. And so these connected challenges are at the heart of our efforts, and certainly I believe human rights should remain very much at the center. Thank you, I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Nada, for this input. And actually, you mentioned the whole of system approach, and this brings me directly now to invite the other panelists to share with us some initial thoughts actually on where human rights currently stand in their agency's policies, program, and practice. And if I can just start from the very end of the panel, Thomas, with you, and invite you to share your thoughts with us.
So thank you very much, Felix, and good afternoon, everyone. So great to represent you here. And of course, we're coming from not only through the table, but also the perspectives, I think, opposite ends in the end. And I'll see how we kind of come together, because I think at UN was set up 160 years ago. It wasn't set up to do human rights, you know, and actually until very recently, even as little as 10 years ago, anytime anyone would try to put even the words human rights now in our treaties would have a huge pushback, you know, and not only from, you know, countries you would think that are pushing back, actually from all the countries, you know, including those who really are strong protectors around the world of human rights and everyone there. So that, but that didn't mean that we're not important in the human rights agenda. And I think that's I think is part of that is essence and part of that is narrative. So in terms of the human rights agenda, look, WTO was created to help the world to talk and communicate. That means freedom of speech and freedom of expression, you know, is actually our essence from the day one. You know, so and that's what we achieve through things that sounds probably rather boring for human rights community, like spectrum coordination, you know, so that people have mobile networks and satellite networks through which they can work together, or developing standards through which they can transfer the information, you know, or actually encrypt the data. For example, one of the important IT set of standards is so-called PKI, so public key infrastructure, all that encryption that people use to protect their privacy and confidentiality of information. And all the development aspects of ours, where we try to bring that connectivity to everyone. So that's been our raison d'etre, but we never spoke about that as a human rights. I think now this is changing, especially from the narrative perspective, and that, of course, then hopefully feeds back to our work. So first of all, the connectivity became essential for a lot of exercise of a lot of other rights. And we see that now, regretfully, in a couple of years, every recent conflict, one of the first things that's targeted or switched off or goes down is connectivity. And the EU actually in the past was pretty shy of expressing itself on it. Now we express ourselves, at least in a few recent wars and conflicts, where we called for ensuring that connectivity is always protected, because for us it's essential to exercise for human rights as such. So we actually took much stronger stance there. But also now, of course, with a complex technology landscape, that human rights aspects become much more complex as well. So if you talk about artificial intelligence, for example, no, so it could also help us, express ourselves better, it could help us to find information better, it could help us in a lot of other things, but it could help us with the, you know, right to health, and we work, for example, World Health Organization a lot on that, with the joint initiative on a global initiative on AI and health, or, you know, we work a lot with UNEP on how to use AI for, you know, early warnings or the environment aspects. But AI has also bias, you know, actually shows that around 45% of AI systems show gender bias. You know, a lot of them also shows racial bias. AI can facilitate, regretfully, misinformation, disinformation that needs to be dealt. And that's actually across all the technologies, that is the problem. So I think now we have to think about that in a much more explicit way. So that means we cannot just say, okay, we're just doing it and somehow it will work. We actually need to think that through the work. And that's not an easy challenge, because a lot of our people, when they come to our study groups, the engineers who deal with the technology. And actually the first conversation is then when you tell them you need to think about human rights, they say, we're not lawyers, no, and we never dealt with that. Why we should start about that? And again, it's not about specific countries or regions. It's actually across the board and very universal in that regard. So then we started slowly but firmly, and I think that thank you for great collaboration for High Commissioner of Human Rights Office. You know, so already we had especially on the standardization angle, we had a good resolution from Human Rights Council of 21, you know, 47/23 that called for collaboration between standards organizations and High Commission of Human Rights. Then we brought to that conversation also other standardization organizations. So here in Geneva, ISO, International Standardization Organization, and IEC, International Electrotechnical Commission, with who we have what we call World Standards Cooperation, joint platform, which now, and we made now human rights as one of the key pillars of that joint collaboration. So we had High Commissioner coming to speak to our meetings, where we resulted in joint program of action. We contributed to the report of High Commissioner to Human Rights Council. You know, now we work further on implementational aspects of that. We actually started internalizing that. So we even have a human rights officer in our standardization bureau. That's his job, is actually to do that, to think about how to integrate human rights. But you cannot say, and that's also usually sometimes, I know how many people have experienced how different agencies work. You cannot, our work is done through member states. So you cannot go to the member states experts and say, this is what you have to do, because they decide what they have to do. We're a secretariat. We can facilitate, we can help. So that means we have to have our bit soft instruments through capacity building, through surveys of our chairs and vice chairs of study groups, through human rights taxonomy, through exposing them to what we're talking about, through having seminars and workshops. So, for example, now a number of member states are championing so-called human-centric approach, in which they brought to our recent World Telecommunications Organization Assembly as a workshop at the side events or other events, to really kind of start galvanizing, if you will, that movement. So without telling participants what to do, kind of exposing them to what they should think about when they do that. And I think that's why this word lens, human rights lens, I think is very good for us, because it's not about kind of set of rules. I mean, it is a set of rules and from international law perspective, but at the same time, for us, it's more like a lens. You know, when you think about standards, when you think about technology, what things you need to think about when you work in that. So the last piece that I'll just very briefly mention is about walking the talk internally. You know, it's also sometimes we forget as organizations. You know, we do a lot to help member states. Sometimes we forget ourselves. And it's still, like, for example, gender equality is still a challenge, you know, across organizations. You know, like we still, if you look at our participants in our world conferences, actually only around 30% of delegates are women. We work to change that. We have what we call networks of women among our delegates, different sectors where we try to galvanize and do the peer-to-peer support. It's working, but slowly. Actually, this World Telecommunications Organization Assembly, I think it backtracked a few percentage points. Actually, we had fewer than 4 years ago. I mean, it's maybe a statistical blip, but it shows it's not an easy thing to do. You know, again, if you look at we have on a junior level, we have a good representation. On a senior level, very D1s, D2s, we have good, but then in the middle, like P4s, P5s, this is a huge challenge there. So again, we need to work. I think the good piece here is, again, how we work the talk is our involvement of stakeholders. I think the good thing there is that ITU from the get-go was multi-stakeholder organization. So we have member states, now 194 of them, just as of a couple of months ago. But we also have around more 1,000 what we call sector members and academia members. So that means people from companies and others, but also civil society organizations. So those civil society organizations participate in ITU work as actually equal participants in a lot of work. They can bring their opinion and can views directly as a members, not as just outside observers. And of course, now we transpose that to the things like WSIS Forum, which is annual kind of multi-stakeholder thing, where they can even play the main and key decision-making role. So I think, and again, so from actually doing the thing for 160 years to actually now explicitly thinking what we're doing, to actually trying to walk the talk. So some of the things we're trying to do together, and I think, you know, together with everyone around this table as well. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that. And actually, let's hear where WHO stands in that. I think we heard a lot of discourse opening actually at ITU. So Katharina Böhme, if you'd like to lead us into that.
Thank you so much, Felix, Nada, colleagues, and especially also thank you to you, all of us, for coming here and for the Geneva Human Rights Platform. I should say up front that I'm not a human rights expert. I'm a medical doctor, and so I'm really pleased to be here and also hopefully learn in a very interactive dialogue. You know, in 3 minutes, let me maybe leave you with 3 main points. The first, human rights are absolutely central to the mandate of the World Health Organization. We have a fundamental belief, and that is that we must see health not as a privilege to earn, but a human right to protect. It's enshrined in our WHO Constitution since 1948, where health is recognized and as a fundamental human right. It's also enshrined in the definition of what health means since 1948, which is not the absence of infirmity of disease, but the presence of physical, mental, and social well-being, right? So when we speak about the right to health, it's the right to health in its widest sense. It's very profound, and it's basically all you need as a human being to be healthy. And that is important because essentially it means there is no health without human rights. The second message I want to leave you with is that we must work together to uphold and protect the right to health in this widest sense and to ensure health for all. You know, all the 194 WHO member states have ratified in at least one human rights treaty that guarantees the right to health, but only 140 countries globally include the right to health in their constitution. And only 4 mention how to finance access to health. So there's a lot of room for improvement. And then, as Nada has described very well, we see a lot of worrying trends and setbacks in many countries, poor and rich, east, west, north, and south, right? So there's no exceptions. And we see setbacks, especially for vulnerable populations on a global basis. Let me perhaps just give you 3 very concrete examples. The one, an unacceptable and very high number of attacks on healthcare and attacks on healthcare workers. This year alone, WHO has verified 1,100 incidents and attacks on healthcare with more than 550 deaths and 1,000 injuries among healthcare workers in 13 countries. And essentially, we see attacks on healthcare being used as a weapon in war. And we have to stand strong and stand against that. In our governance bodies, we see an unprecedented polarization, exactly as Nada has said, on human rights matters. We see strong pushback on gender language, strong pushback on sexual reproductive rights. And we see that any votes and elections around these topics get tighter and tighter, right? So, it shows me being in charge of governance also at WHO, that this is not just a few countries, it gets a larger and larger number of countries. And then at country level, and you all know this, we see discriminatory laws having been ratified or underway to limit sexual reproductive health rights, to criminalize or further marginalize LGBTQI+ populations in particular. And we see this also in our health numbers, right? 257 million women have no access to contraception, for example, right? So this has very concrete consequences. So given, this scenario, given these trends that we see, right, and just to let you know, at WHO we receive death threats on a daily basis around these matters. In our country offices, especially, of course, in fragile countries, in Gaza, etc., right, the situation is very precarious for many of our teams on the ground. So what can we do together, and how can we step up together as we work to protect health as a human right? And as we protect the access to healthcare for everyone. So, for us at WHO, what we've clearly learned is that we have a long way to go still. We're intensifying our work with communities, with civil society in countries. We've set up a civil society commission also to help advise us on how we can step up this work further. But in a nutshell, we do 3 things. We advocate, we raise awareness, and we work with countries and governments, and as you said, basically build capacity through training, through webinars, through workshops, and through our on-the-ground work to protect access to healthcare. Over the last just 12 months, for example, our staff directly executed 40 million primary healthcare visits, right? So in fragile settings, we have to, at the moment, take on a lot of healthcare work directly. This year's World Health Day was entitled "My Right, My Health," and that was for a good reason. It is to give all of us the opportunity to stand up and raise our voice as we need to, and as it's a critical moment. So, let me perhaps, instead of giving you more examples on what we do, maybe just end by pleading that, as Nada said, these are critical times. We are in a very difficult situation collectively as the UN. We need to work more together with each other, but also with all of you to maintain, the human rights and the access to right globally. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this. And Mr. Kreilhuber, if I can ask you to continue and say what UNEP is doing, well, in this all mechanisms, I would say, because that's what we say always in human rights, but in the all agencies approach and the all over approach in the UN system, please.
Thank you, Felix, and thank you for the invitation. From UNEP's standpoint, what may now seem obvious took a long time to materialize. And I'm talking about the link between environment and human rights. Katharina, you spoke to the impact of health and human rights, right? According to your own estimates, I believe 99% of the world's population breathe unsafe air, right? So there you already have an immediate link between environment and human rights. But this link was already incorporated into the Stockholm Declaration in 1972 on the human environment, which of course spurred the creation of UNEP. And yet, it took until 2021, until the Human Rights Council established that there is a human right to a clean and healthy and sustainable environment, which was then followed by the UNGA resolution 1 year later. At the national level, governments have been much more progressive. We have now well over 160 countries around the world that recognize a right to a clean, healthy, sustainable an environment in some quality in their national constitutions or through regional human rights instruments. So for UNEP, this is very important. It has not been an easy journey, but we've worked very closely with the Office of the High Commissioner, together with our UN partners, to make sure that member states understand these linkages and are more comfortable with the global recognition of something that they have recognized at the national or regional level already. But now that we have this right, we need to unpack it and make sure it is applied, it is respected, it is protected, it is fulfilled. And what this means for UNEP is essentially action on the environment, action on the triple planetary crisis of climate change, nature and land loss, and pollution that we currently face. You may be familiar that this year is a year of what we call triple COPs, conferences of the parties of the Climate Change Convention, Biodiversity Convention, which just concluded in Cali in Colombia, and later in the year in Saudi Arabia on desertification. In addition, we hope to end the year with the successful adoption of a treaty on plastics. Just to say that there is a lot that the international community can do through these fora, through these gatherings, to give meaning also to the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. For UNEP internally, human rights is part of our programming. It is part of our medium-term strategy. It is part of our program of work through something what we call a foundational program around environmental governance, which includes norms, regulations, law, environmental law, through which we also address human rights. In practice, this means that we, through our environmental law program, the Montevideo Environmental Law Program, which has been in existence since 1982 and was also part of this journey to establish more closely the links between human rights and the environment. Through this program, we support countries in substantive aspects to give meaning to this human right. This means we support countries in making sure they have adequate legislation around pollution that is implementable, that they have adequate legislation to implement many of these commitments that governments take at the international level, that they are effectively incorporated at the national level. But we also work with governments around procedural rights. And there, of course, we had very, very encouraging developments at the regional level. We are here in Geneva, the Aarhus Convention, but also in Latin America and the Caribbean, the Escazú Agreement, which gives meaning to some procedural rights aspects that are particularly important to achieving the right to a clean and healthy and sustainable environment. Access to justice in environmental matters, access to information in environmental matters. How are citizens, claiming their right to clean air, for instance, if they have no information how good or bad the air is where they live? And also, of course, participatory rights. And these we see are under attack all around the world. We see a decline in the observance of procedural rights in terms of environmental decision-making for local community stakeholders, indigenous peoples, marginalized groups, gender, women and girls. And that's perhaps an aspect I would like to end with in my introductory remarks, to really encourage also us to focus on the people that are, and my previous speakers have already spoken to this as well, to the people who are at the front lines of defending these human rights. And in the field of the environment, it's the environmental rights defenders who we also see under increasing attack around the world for a variety of reasons. And UNEP has adopted a specific policy on the protection of environmental defenders. Now, again, this is something where we cannot go it alone as UNEP. We work with our partners, we work with the Office of the High Commissioner, but what the policy intends to do is shine a light on abuses in that area, shine a light on the plight that befalls many of these environmental rights defenders, and give them a voice. Perhaps I'll stop it here.
Thank you very much, and we'll continue, of course, in the second round. And Agi Veres, if I can turn to you. So Thomas said he was the furthest away from human rights. You're sitting next to Nada. Is there a certain meaning in this? I have to say we did not place you expressly like that, but please, where is human rights in UNDP's work?
Yes, of course, we're very, very close to human rights, although you did the seating, but I think it describes it very well, because from UNDP's perspective, it's really embedded in everything we do. So sometimes we do get questions from our constituencies, what is UNDP doing on human rights? And our answer, I think, overall is that we're doing everything on human rights, because everything we do on governance, on crisis, on the environment, on financing, has to have the human rights lens embedded in it, and has to have the actions that actually will support and really underscore the principles that we are all talking about. But I'd like to put it into three main categories in terms of what we as a leading development agency do vis-a-vis human rights, and especially through the perspective that we are a field-based organization. So I always say in these dialogues that, what matters is what happens in the field. What matters is actually how it affects the lives of people that we work with in the developing countries where we work. So we can have wonderful policy dialogues and resolutions, but if they are not taken to the level of impact and transformation, then we're losing an opportunity. So that's where UNDP comes in. What we'd like to do and what we're aiming to do is connect the field realities and implementation to the very important policy levels and normative agendas, and work very closely with the agencies who are carrying that normative agenda, who are specialized in certain fields, and then work very closely also at the level of the field. So three kind of approaches, if you wish. One is the overall integration and embedding of across all policy levels, and I think this is where it's extremely important that we take the approach of the Sustainable Development Goals, and what we need to make sure is that they are met in an inclusive, rights-based manner that leaves no one behind. So if I really need to summarize it in a quite simplistic way, that's what integration and embedding means, is that we need to achieve it, but with those principles insights. We also believe that by integrating these human rights into all levels where we work, we really foster resilience not just at the national level, but at the level of communities, give agencies to people, justice and peace, and we help enable the countries to address crisis and support their inclusive development. So at the end of the day, how do we empower those that we are trying to support to take this challenge? The second is exactly on this point, to go a little bit further. We also work very closely at the level of strengthening institutions and capacities. We have very specific interventions supporting national human rights institutions, how they can take their role and how they can actually help at the national level. And as many of you know, the context matters. And because we work in other areas in the same context where we're helping national human rights institutions, we're also trying to connect the dots and even within sensitive situations, trying to find an entry point where we can have a shared pathway forward of strengthening these capacities. Helping countries to build robust institutions and frameworks is not only bettering and protecting and promoting human rights, but it's really about embedding those same human rights principles into the national development plans, into the national policies, in assisting national partners, the stakeholders on the ground, beyond the system that we may represent there, but within the systems at the national and local level as well. And the third area is really on the actual implementation. How do we help the implementation? How do we provide the tools? We have very comprehensive development tools and related to all layers of human rights, of course, working very closely with other partners. And these are resources that provide our country offices, our partners, with concrete guidance, for example, on mainstreaming, concrete guidance of how to handle very sensitive situations, how to operate in conflict, how to partner with the business sector, how are we dealing now with private sector engagements that we're all trying to strengthen, but we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that these same human rights principles should be also upheld. So these tools are particularly valuable in complex political context where aligning programs with human rights really requires a very nuanced approach and a very good understanding of the local context. And because we are on the ground with our programs overall across the many SDGs, I think we're able to do that. So these are, I would say, the three areas, but I want to also leave this just with one point on looking at the future, because we're all reflecting on what we're doing and how we are trying to do that. But I think we're all very conscious about kind of what's coming, and we're all working on the anticipatory actions as well. And you mentioned climate, that's an obvious one. Then around the whole financing agenda. We are working on, all of us, working on how we are aligning finance. So how are we taking the human rights lens and putting that into that alignment in terms of the financing we're trying to mobilize beyond the traditional grant instruments? And there's a lot of innovative finance instruments coming up. So, you know, the question to ourselves is, are we doing the best integration of these principles into these new instruments that are coming out, aligning finance that will actually promote human rights? And lastly, which I think we're going to come back to, but, you know, the big question mark of digital and AI. And we should not underestimate the speed that it's taking in an environment where the legislation norms mean the entire kind of guidance and rules mechanism is way behind the development of the technology. And I think we really need to think about this in a very kind of future-focused manner and develop already the responses to problems that we don't have yet, but we know we're going to have them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank you all for this first round and the initial remarks, very much like looking what's happening, the long way you came, or also the future you want to go to. So in the morning panels that we had here in the room and also the workshops, particularly human rights aspects in the global policy fields of health, environment, conflict, development, and citizens' self-determination and IT regulation have come up. And we'd like to bring some of those questions and recommendations to you, being aware, of course, that you couldn't prepare too much for that because it's really just coming out of the workshops. But so Virginia and I will just bring those questions to you, maybe for initial reflections, just that can take us further in our deliberations and in the thinking in the year to come also. So would you like to start, Virginia? And I'll join you over there.
Very much, and thank you to all the speakers. I think in the second round we'll have a better opportunity of going back to some of the measures you've already taken in terms of bringing the agencies together, this whole of a system approach. But for now, we're going to concentrate on the questions that you do not know what the questions are because they were developed during the workshop. So, Katharina, to you, I have two questions that came up in the workshop. One of them was this discussion about health preparedness. And I think there was a lot of exchange on preparedness, but somehow the doubt is still there. Who are the actors that need to contribute to health preparedness? And in what ways can they do so if you really want to be successful in what you aim? And my second question is, this morning we had also an academic panel, and there was a lot of discussion also on the pandemic treaty and on how the human rights language fits in or doesn't fit in there. But one of the issues also was that not everything can be done by hard law. There are soft law standards and other instruments that can be used to move the human rights agenda further. And the question was, how do you make sure that these soft law instruments that you develop are being implemented at the national level, keeping human rights commitments in mind? Thank you.
Super easy. Yeah. So, let me quickly think, but first of all, as you said, we have the negotiations on the pandemic agreement or a pandemic treaty ongoing at the World Health Organization at the moment. So we have all our member states at the moment over there negotiating, and I would say equity is probably the topic there that divides and unites at the same time the most, right? And equity has a lot to do with human rights, and inequity and the experience of inequity, for many countries came directly from COVID. And so, let me, perhaps say that these questions, I think that you just mentioned, have a lot to do with also the shortcomings that many countries, many populations, many communities saw during COVID. Let me perhaps also say that many people think the next pandemic is far away, but when we look at this from a WHO perspective, that's very much the question, right? We currently manage 38 graded health emergencies, which is a record number. We see an steep upward trend, and we certainly believe and see that, the triple C, we also have a triple C, but with very different meaning in terms of climate change, conflict, and contagion, and climate change driving zoonotic spillovers, driving an ever-increasing number of outbreaks, also vastly increases the risk of the next pandemic. In the United States, the H5N1 outbreak, certainly the greatest likelihood of a next pandemic remains an influenza outbreak. So I'm just saying this because, the discussions on pandemic preparedness always seem to be so futuristic, but actually it's here and now, right? We have a Marburg outbreak as we speak. We have a major H5N1 outbreak as we speak, and we see, for example, 31 cholera outbreaks, massive cholera outbreaks around the world as we speak. So, perhaps just to answer the question on who are the players and how are we implementing soft laws, right? So I do feel that COVID has led to erosion of trust worldwide in governments. And I think that, and erosion also in the trust in science. And I feel with that, the role of community networks and civil society has actually become even much more important. And so when I look at who are the players for us at WHO to work with the most, aside from government, yes, we need an all-of-society approach, exactly also for what I mentioned, right? This is very linked to environment, it's very linked to animal health, human health, etc. But it's in terms of the groups we need to work with, I would really want to point out its communities and its civil societies that I would put front and center as the players. And of course, we've learned a lot also about working with the private sector, etc. But when it comes to the concrete shortcomings in pandemics, I would say the weakest link during COVID, was the lack to engage adequately communities on the ground from the get-go. We've done that much better in the later phases of the pandemic. We've worked a lot also with faith-based groups, etc. But I would say each and every country I know of has started with that way too late. So perhaps for now, to make it interactive, I'll leave it there and hand back to you, but happy to go into greater detail later.
Thank you very much. Then I'll bring in the next question to your neighbor, Thomas, and I'll bring the questions one by one. And by the way, I want to thank very much the moderators and the rapporteurs of the working groups in the morning who actually supplied those questions to us. And I hope that those who participated in the workshops do find their main discussions well reflected. So I would like to ask actually a question about the business part of our artificial intelligence, digital governance, how that is actually taken up by ITU. You just mentioned actually before the the fact that you do have also other members than states, so business is an integral part, but how do you basically balance the risk of corporate capture via leave no one behind?
No, thank you very much. Indeed, it's, thanks, Felix, a lot for this question. I think there's a few layers there as well, and there's a few hats that ITU is wearing in those different layers. So first layer is, of course, our own as ITU organizational layer, which are where we, as I mentioned, we have a sector members. We have a governance that still puts member states on the top, in terms of our parliamentary conference and our council, but then private sector and other stakeholders participate in this actual practical work, so in terms of a standard development and others. So I think the checks and balances are coming from these different governance layers, so basically where solutions are found where everyone is at the table, but the governance of that system is of course set up then by certain stakeholders as well. But then we have, when we go, so this is ITU, but then when we go further, for example, especially next layer is all interagency layer at the UN system, and there we are very proudly, together with UNESCO, personally myself, together with Gabriela Ramos of UNESCO, we're co-leading what is called Interagency Working Group on Artificial Intelligence, and it's now has been for around since 2021, and the way where all the UN agencies and actually all the colleagues here around the table and represented there, and we're doing pretty good coordination work together. We're doing the pretty good coordination work together to make sure that we actually provide, UN-wide view what's being done. For example, we produce what is called UN white paper on governance of AI as an input to Secretary General's high-level advisory board on AI, where we kind of looked at the different layers and different instruments that different colleagues are doing. And then you see then from ITU standards, from technical standards, we now have around 100 of them developed, and then 150 in the development to let's say UNESCO, for example, AI ethical guidelines on how to implement AI. To colleagues here around the table have different other aspects. So I mean, I don't want to speak to colleagues, but UNDP has assessment methodology, which is has again guidance for human rights and human rights and AI, and so we have all these governance frameworks that allows us to bring one UN together. Now also we now started under another role in this regard. ITU now was entrusted by Secretary General to lead together with the tech envoy, UNSG tech envoy, what is called Working Group on Digital Technology. So this group will be working now to implement Pact of the Future's digital aspects. So there's Global Digital Compact and others. And we had, as part of that, we had now two what we call Geneva kitchen breakfasts in Geneva. Again, some colleagues were personally there, and where we, as all the UN agencies, were actually together discussing how Geneva could contribute, and then of course how we should work together with others. And Geneva we took in a very broad way, so that means basically everyone who was there around, and then who was represented there came. So, but one of the topics exactly in that one was identified that we as UN as a total, we need to kind of figure out how we work with the private sector together and how we leverage these different aspects of UN. Part of the UN are procurers, part of the UN are regulators like ourselves, part of the UN are set values frameworks, like with CSR, part of the UN works with the development aspects with the private sector, how we can actually have that comprehensive engagement. And then we'll definitely be picked up together with the colleagues. The final layer is this called broad multi-stakeholder engagement layer. And that's for us, of course, is our annual WSIS Forum events. And now last year and the next year will be WSIS high-level event because we're in the World Summit Information Society 20+20 period. And then our AI for Good summits, so that we had also together in the same week. So, of course, that's where we have all those different stakeholders coming together to exchange, to network, but also to produce. So last year we had our first ever AI Governance Day. And I think interesting thing there was a lot of governments there was for the first time when they were involved in a global process on AI as well, with the private sector leaders sitting across the table. So, and that again feeds in all the other governance processes as well. So I think we're trying to engage with different processes, and different processes like serve their own purpose. Some of them are decision-making, some of them are information gathering, some of them are coordinating. I think through that we're trying to have a comprehensive picture.
Thank you. And if I can just follow up with a other question on another stakeholder, because one of the parts of the discussion of the morning was also smart cities. So the question there was, can local and regional governments be brought better into the international policy making, given their proximity to rights holders? So is that also part of the summits you were mentioning, or is that a different approach as parts of government?
No, so they should. And for example, specific example in our WSIS forum and through the WSIS process, for example, Global Cities Hub is our big partner there, and we work with them on the city-level engagement. However, I could tell you, it's not very easy for individualized agency like ITU, to go deep in the local communities. We have some projects where we have, for example, what's called Smart Villages, Smart Island projects, where we're working in a kind of global transformation on community level. So that means, and that's again another example, by the way, how UN works together, because this project's idea of SSITU goes there as an infrastructure piece together with a World Health Organization that so talks about health, Food and Agriculture Organization talks about agriculture, and we try to really do those comprehensive solutions on the community level. However, I think the only way to achieve that, and that's kind of speaking for an organization that's 900 people strong, and around 13 offices around the world, only to do that is if we do that across the UN and ecosystem, because I think otherwise to go to each individual community from the UN perspective is impossible. And then still, of course, from our perspective, let's not forget while we engage communities that we still need to engage all the countries. Because as I mentioned there, some of the, for example, newer discussions like AI governance discussions, governments say, look, we haven't been involved. A lot of countries, only half of the governments have their own AI policies, 85% lack AI regulations. So basically what I'm trying to say, we need to go to the communities, but sometimes by leapfrogging to communities, we shouldn't disintermediate the governments who will, in the end of the day, making a lot of important decisions as well, and who end up making also decisions in our governing bodies as well. So if you by chance disintermediate them, I don't think will also be good for the international ecosystem.
Thank you very much. And if I can come to you, Mr. Kreilhuber, you have spoken about the procedural rights actually and about SKSU and Aarhus agreements also, but we have two specific questions focusing on conflict situations, conflict contexts. So the one question was how UNEP actually would also use those procedural rights in particular in the conflict context, so in an ongoing conflict. And secondly, there was a discussion where people actually could go who are affected by environmental conflict. It seems there is actually only the UN human rights system for them to turn to, but so how can UNEP then also pick up what is done and discussed in those human rights mechanisms? So again, two quite conflict-related questions.
Yeah, thanks, Felix. We are on the eve of the International Day for the Prevention of the Exploitation of the Environment in Armed Conflict. And what has characterized this area over the past 2 decades is sort of a shift, right? The actors have multiplied, and we have now a different understanding of the risks, including the role that the environment plays in conflict scenarios. This has been highlighted by the Secretary General in his new agenda for peace. You mentioned the Pact for the Future, right? But we also see it in the number of requests that come from member states for UNEP's assistance in conflict and disaster scenarios. Over the past 2 decades, we've assisted more than 20 countries, and that is really UNEP's core mandate, right? We operate within the UN family, so our mandates are different. And UNEP's mandate in the field of conflicts and disasters is really to assess the damage to the environment. That's what we have done, for instance, in Ukraine. Kakhovka Dam breach, we did an assessment. We are advising the government in Ukraine on a green reconstruction. The same has happened remotely for Gaza, Sudan, Afghanistan, many other conflict areas. And so the focus there is on documenting the damage to the environment. But also, secondly, to highlight the importance of protecting the environment in these conflicts, because the damage to the environment lasts well beyond the last bullet has been fired, well beyond when the last bullet has been fired. For Ukraine, for instance, our estimations are that it will take several generations to remedy the damage there. Now, to your specific question, in terms of the mechanisms, UNEP is perhaps in this concert of UN agencies not the right agency particularly to deal with such complaints, but in the context of our environmental assessments, we work with our partners, as I have said, to minimize that damage where possible and support communities and local stakeholders in that green reconstruction.
Thank you very much. Virginia, I hand it over to you again.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I turn to you, NDP now. And in your opening statement, you refer to 3 aspects of your mandate which provide the right context for my questions. And that is that one of your concerns is the realization of human rights on the ground. The other one is that you have this mandate also to strengthen institutions and capacities in embedding human rights in their development plans. And you also spoke of the speed of digitalization as against the slowness of regulations. And my questions do have to do exactly with the digital tools, but they're different ends of the spectrum. So I'll take the question one by one like Felix has done. The first is, what do you think of the importance of enhanced monitoring to digital integration? Do you see that happening in the context of interdisciplinarity and support to the implementation of human rights recommendations, including through these digital tools? Do you think there's anything more you could do to strengthen capacities of national actors in this particular area? That's my first question.
Thank you. So maybe just to be very specific to the question in terms of the monitoring tools, because we have some really good examples of that. I mean, one of the main advantages that we see of the digital transformation is actually to have the ability to do analysis, monitoring, in a much faster, more efficient way. It's with the aim of course, the digital transformation to promote the inclusivity and transparency. And then, when we look at specific solutions, for example, in Pakistan, we have the example of the Human Rights Information Management System, which is now a digital dashboard that we have developed in collaboration with the Pakistan's Ministry of Human Rights. And the system actually kind of monitors and tracks the country's progress on their human rights commitments, including those outlined in the UPR and international human rights treaties. So it's a real live data that helps the government to see what is going on, not just at the level of the recommendations, but those that are contributing to their implementation and achievement. So I think, this is a good example that shows that, yes, of course, it's very helpful, because anything that makes it easier for monitoring and tracking is progress. On the other hand, of course, it carries a lot of risks. And then we need to look at those risks as well. But before I may go into the risk, I think in terms of the capacities, what I alluded to in my opening part is also about not just the future of digital, but the future of governance, and they go a little bit hand in hand. So how can we prepare the governments who will be faced with this really fast transforming digital future, especially in developing countries where they are struggling to keep up with the past and the present. How can we expect them to keep up with the future already? So, specifically on AI and digital, we are trying to really help them develop the capacities that they will need to respond to this. And one of the very specific tools that we have is this AI readiness assessment tool that helps countries analyze the AI readiness of the integration of AI, the national strategies, the capacities, their digital infrastructure, and so forth. And then based on that, we can then help with some of that. And our focus is really on the digital public goods, the digital infrastructure in the countries, so that, they have the basics in space and in place, and then they can focus on a little bit more kind of value-added role of government. And then, in this, of course, when we talk about human rights, and everybody is talking about working together as a system. And of course, we want to support governments and, other kind of stakeholders in terms of providing the safeguards and developing the policies. But I really think if we're not doing this together with the private sector, very soon we're going to hit a problem, in the sense that the gap that we have now between public and private sector, not just in terms of developing AI, developing digital technology, but the ability to engage with it and the ability to apply it for AI for good, as you said, Thomas. And this gap is going to grow unless we really invest in this system-wide approach and bring the private sector around the table, knowing that they are there to do business. They are not there to do the government jobs. They are not there to do our job. But they do have a role to play, and we need to kind of lean on that.
Thank you. I was divided here between Felix and you. But I take my second question because you said you would speak of the risks later. And my second question has to do with the risks of this over-reliance on digital tools. Is that, of course, there's a potential, but then there's also this danger that it could become a box-ticking exercise.
Yes.
And therefore, in the workshop, there was this huge push to stress the need for human involvement and human expertise to ensure that there's impactful monitoring. That's what we're looking for. Mm-hmm. So what's your take on this?
Yes, I think it's absolutely right, and I really can't claim wisdom to this. Otherwise, I probably would be sitting somewhere higher up somewhere if I had the answer to this. But I think what's really important is the recognition that there is this risk. And for example, I mean, if you think in everyday lives that we have in terms of how the box ticking actually is happening. In the past, I don't know, some of you are working maybe in areas where you need to approve something. So in the past, you used to have a bunch of documents, you reviewed them to make sure everything is fine. Then there was somewhere where you signed and so forth. Nowadays, it's all digitalized. So sometimes you just get a notification to say, do you approve? And it can become a box-ticking exercise if you're not opening the documents behind it, but it's kind of easy with the digital technology to miss some of those steps. So I think it's a little bit similar on the monitoring. If we just take the process and take advantage of what it offers, which is an at-a-glance view of how everything is, then it can easily become a box-ticking exercise. But if we really invest, as you said, in the human capacities that actually want to understand the data behind it, understand the actions behind it, and look at that. And this is what we need to encourage with our capacity building with those who are interacting with these tools, that it doesn't become just simply reading the green, yellow, and red lights in the systems, but to really understand what that data means. And I think if you look around governance in general, unfortunately, we're losing that interpretation of data and looking behind. So definitely the risk is there, and I believe that we have to invest more into the analytical and kind of critical thinking capability of those that are interacting with these systems.
Thank you all very much for reacting to the questions also coming from the workshops. But of course, beyond the workshops, we had a broader discussion also in the keynote and in the opening panel. And I'm happy to note that we have in the room also high-level representatives of UNHCR and WIPO, who I would like to ask to share with us just very briefly also their views on the topic. If I can start, if I have a handheld microphone, please, over here, with Ms. Hamu of WIPO. Yeah. Can you?
Okay. Good afternoon, and thank you for this opportunity to share also WIPO's perspective. I would like just to start by the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, which recognizes the importance of scientific, literary, and artistic production. I know that often we encounter sometimes the perception that IP and human rights are two separate fields. But in WIPO, we don't believe so. We think that IP system feeds from the same waters as the Universal Declaration. It is centered around human creativity and inventiveness, just like human rights are centered around human dignity and fulfillment. For WIPO, IP is an enabler, and it's delivering a fairer, better and more sustainable world, including by addressing global challenges. We have heard some thoughts from WHO about the global health issues, the climate change, and we know how technology is important in mitigating all these challenges. We know also that IP translates great creativity and invention, which human is center in this, and there I'm sure that IP helps to promote sustainable development goals, human rights, and also the pact for the future and a better future, I will add. I would like just to mention maybe a concrete example, because maybe it's if I'm talking just about IP without giving examples, we will always think, oh, IP is not for all. No, IP is for all. And for example, we are supporting indigenous people as well as local communities. And recently on May 24, WIPO member states were able to adopt by consensus a new treaty on intellectual property, genetic resources, and associated traditional knowledge. This is the first WIPO treaty to address the interface between IP, genetic resources, and associated traditional knowledge. And the first treaty to include provisions specifically for indigenous and local communities. But it's not just about a treaty, but it's also about some concrete supports to women entrepreneurs, indigenous people. We have a lot of training program, monitoring and matchmaking programs on IP for entrepreneurs, not only local, coming from local communities, but beyond. This is one concrete example. I would like just to add that the IP system has always continued to respond to technological changes, including the development of AI, as we have heard some discussion around AI. WIPO is seeing many local entrepreneurs who are hungry to use AI to improve lives and livelihoods. And WIPO is conducting some great conversation about around IP and AI. These conversations are bringing a large number of persons, so far 9,000, coming from more than 170 countries. There is a new conversation that started only today, and WIPO is trying in this field of AI to provide also sources of reliable information and tools. It's also driving projects that address the digital divide. I would like just to say that we remain committed and to work all together, I think, to help to make our world better, to make IP more inclusive. I think more and more patent applications are coming from Asia, from Latin America, from Africa, even 70% are coming, and I think IP is more and more inclusive. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I am Ms. Hamou, Director of External Relations Division, and if I can turn to Deputy Director Eba of UNHCR, just for a short.
Thank you very much, Felix. Really, I would like to start by thanking the organizers of today's event for this much-needed conversation. We heard it from Nada very clearly, that the time that we are living in calls for all of us to look beyond the mandate of our respective organizations and to come together in the spirit of connectivity to address the particular moment that we are in. We at UNHCR are very aware that we are at an unprecedented moment. 122 million people are forcibly displaced across the world. 122 million women, children, and men who have been forced to flee in search of safety. In some parts of the world, we see extraordinary illustrations of solidarity, welcoming refugees. Unfortunately, this is not the case in many parts of the world, where to the contrary, we are confronted with pushback, denial of access to asylum, the very notion of the right to safety, which is enshrined in the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, is being contested. This is the moment we are in. And in the face of it, what should we do? And I very much appreciate some of the points that you made, Nada, at the very beginning, calling on each one of us to find the strength to work together. This is the time for interconnection, working together as UN agencies, as the whole of the world, to address the unprecedented moment we are in. And we at UNHCR are trying to do that. Just last year, we helped, together with our colleagues at OHCHR, establish what we refer to as the Platform of Independent Experts on Refugee Rights, which brings together UN independent experts together with regional experts from regional mechanisms across the world. The African system, the inter-American system, and we are also branching out to the European system because we believe that this is the only way to ensure that the universality of access to asylum can be upheld by talking to all regions and all parts of the world. We also believe, and I agree with your words at the beginning, Nada, that this is also the time for agility and for renewed engagement. Now is not the time to retreat, and we need to come up with novel ideas that can bring all around the table to address the challenges that we are confronted with. An example that we are advancing at UNHCR is what we refer to as the whole-of-route approach to dealing with the challenges of mixed movement. As we see refugees, asylum seekers, but also migrants using the same route in search of safety for some, in search of opportunities for others, we are seeing across the world people dying at sea, dying in desert, dying in forests, with no effort consistently to address the need to save lives. And so we've been calling as UNHCR, together with IOM, together with the IFRC and many other stakeholders, to address this situation by coming together, building platform, working in countries of asylum, in countries of transit, in countries of destination, just to say how important today's conversation is. And I was very pleased to hear you all speak about what you are doing in your respective organizations, and looking forward to continuing this connectivity, as you put it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. This is like it was closing remarks already, but it's not closing remarks yet. If you just allow us, as we start late, to go 10 minutes over, but we'll then wrap it up, because we do want to give a chance now to you, Nada, to react to this input. And then Virginia has one last question with a maybe 1-minute reply by everyone. Be prepared.
Just a chance again, with the apologies for the late delay, my fault. Just to say, normally when we sit around the table and we speak, it seems as if we're speaking at a problem. I want to say that this problem has largely been fixed, as you can hear from my colleagues. I agree. I think it was UNEP who said it hasn't always been so apparent and so obvious to all constituencies, but I think we're in a place where we understand that upholding and promoting human rights is actually a core common endeavor, and I think that we really have moved the needle on many of these issues. That particularly because we see the impact on the ground. What is very important is that this is not just policy. Aggie gave one example, Pakistan, but really we could have given many others where we are working very, very closely together. I have a few sheets that my colleagues will be very upset that I didn't use, but they are very, very clear examples of where human rights advice has become more practical. It is more embedded. We have a system of human rights advisors now who sit in country teams, just as peace and development advisors do, and they have really been instrumental to making sure that we can together actually give the advice that will be implemented. To say on that, just listening back, I think it was Thomas who said, we can't tell member states what to do, but we can tell them how. And I think our experience is that member states do want good advice. So, and again, and I think that Katarina mentioned just during COVID, we had internet shutdowns, for example. We do not second judge the sovereignty or the prerogative of imposing law and order, like the public order, regulations. But how you do it is super important. And there is a way to preserve the flow of information to vulnerable groups without cutting off the lifeline that is about access to the internet. So there were many, many interesting examples, of how you can use detention and jails without overcrowding. Again, from COVID, we had some really good examples of what you could do. So we've gotten better at the how, which is also very important to our work together. Second, we really don't need to have human rights experts everywhere throughout the system, because we're offering to put ours at disposal, is number one. Second, because we also are realizing very, very quickly, we need more social scientists, we need more data analysts, we need more program managers. We are keen to have anthropologists and sociologists and economists, because that's how we work now more and more. It's not the thing of just devising, the policy and the conventions and the treaties. We have specialized bodies to do that, but the real issue is how do we make it really practical to close the first gap is maybe between international standards and national law, but the second gap is national law and its implementation. And that second one is critical for all of our work. And I just want to use, to say, one thing we can do more of, I think, is bring our constituencies more closely together. Again, we talked about that we all work with the private sector, we all work with various aspects, but this is my fourth UN entity, and I remember at the ILO, who is sadly not here because of a scheduling issue, but I had a very hard time convincing trade unions that they were actually part of civil society. And I think you'd still find some now who do not see themselves as part of civil society, but in actual fact, when push came to shove, they saw that they were battling the same pushback. And that helped us much more to say labor rights are human rights, and therefore we're all in this together. So just to say that those are opportunities. Just finally, just to show how symbiotic the relationship is between all these mandates, because again, I think sometimes at the work level you might think that we're not, but we are, as you've heard today. We had a very interesting Human Rights Council mandate on the nuclear legacy of the Republic of the Marshall Islands. And I must say, there is an environmental aspect because it's a disaster and it's a small island developing states. There is a health aspect very clearly because it's an exposed population to the radiation. There was a very strong governance aspect and leaving no one behind because there were indigenous populations. And of course, part of the solution will come with digital solutions because we needed repositories of data and understanding of trends and analytics. So just to say that for us, it's so self-evident that I'm glad you see that it's across the board now. And I'm sure in these rather difficult times, we will need to draw more on each other. But thank you for all the support and thank you for the engagement throughout the day, I think. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think part of the, my question probably has been answered, but I will still take my chance. But I can only give you 1 minute each, so I'll be quick too. In all our workshops, we heard a lot of conversation about the impression people still have of siloing and compartmentalization among the agencies. And on the other hand, everyone spoke of the need for inclusivity and transdisciplinarity and an integrated human rights approach, etc. So if I give you 1 minute each for one practical thought you would like to leave with us for the future. Taking into account already what you have done already, but what more could you do? Could you tell us you could do in 1 minute? Thank you. Can I start with you?
Chair, I'll directly respond to the question. But first of all, I'm very proud and thank you that words digital and connectivity were as key keywords today as much as human rights. So I think that actually shows how close we're coming, even though we started far, with this notion of being far. I think that's human rights and digital connectivity come together. I think the fact is, I think, not saying what we should do more, this reiterating what Nada said about, I wouldn't say the issue is resolved. I think definitely the panel today shows that this interconnectivity between agencies, mandates, stakeholders, communities already there. And I think now is just how do we practically and every day resolve that and work it together, so that we still remind ourselves every day that how we need each other and how we really leverage of each other. And I think that's rather than creating new structures here, now it's about practicing the muscle, I think. So thank you.
Yeah, just to build on that, I think the last thing we need is new structures, but rather breaking silos. And I do think that the crises we're in today have helped us a lot to break these silos, just simply because we were forced to do so. We've had the example of climate change already. When I look at antimicrobial resistance as another example, right, we just so much see how much we need each other and how it all flows together, and the same is true for outbreaks, pandemics. So, I just feel, and you mentioned, of course, artificial intelligence and digital health. So I think, what we have learned, though, is that it's not enough to work together at the global level, but to actually bring this down and break this down to concrete collaboration at country level. And I think that's where the next steps lies for us jointly as a UN to become more successful. Thank you.
Thank you, Virginia. I think, to echo what my colleagues have said, if there's one thing I think that unites all of us as UN agencies, it is human rights. And so we just need to do better in talking to each other. There are other areas that unite us as well. Health, environment, right? Increasingly are issues that almost every agency has to deal with. Thomas and I, we were just discussing artificial intelligence. There's also a huge environmental impact of artificial intelligence. But when it comes to human rights, and we also talked about conflicts, I think what we're facing is on the one hand a normative challenge, and Nada, you mentioned a social challenge or a challenge of socializing well-established norms that are now being challenged around the world. And I think that's where we have to come together and really fight back, if you allow me that choice of language. Because as you have said, Eva, it's not the time to retreat. It's time to stand our ground for these norms, for human rights. And finally, maybe a little bit of an off-the-cuff comment, if you allow me. As a lawyer, I'm not a fan of soft law, right? Perhaps it's time to come up with something else, notwithstanding all the merits that soft law has. But if we say something is soft, the other one is hard, we risk, opening the door to make well-established law soft law, and then it's a slippery slope. So I'll finish on that. Thank you.
I guess maybe I'll be a little bit more positive and not aspirational, but celebrating what we already have. Because, before coming to Geneva a few years ago, I spent my 20 years in developing countries working in the field. And I think there this integration is much stronger than we admit or we talk about here at Geneva level or New York level. Because the UN system, in most cases, what I've seen, it works on the ground. And it works, I think, for two reasons. And of course, there are always exceptions, there are always situations, but it works for two reasons. One, because there's a realization there's simply not enough resources to duplicate each other's work. So we have to work together, otherwise we're just going to become irrelevant. And the second is because, and this is where I think the integration really comes from, and that's where we should push for. It's because when we're working in the field, we are faced with the people who want people-centered solutions. They want integrated solutions, not because we're calling them integrated, but because they wake up in the morning facing a complex set of challenges, and they want us being there to help them, not to be there and kind of fight amongst ourselves and trying to figure out who is right and who is wrong. They want jobs, they want a standard kind of good life, especially the youth. They want internet, very specific things. They want to eat, they want to have opportunities, they want to travel, they want to connect to the world, they want to have their voice heard. And, you know, we, as a UN system, are providing solutions to that. And I think more and more we are doing it in an integrated manner. So I'm a bit more positive on that it's not just that we should do more, but we should also recognize that a lot is happening along these lines. Thank you.
Nada?
Was that for me too? Sure. Yeah, just to say, we are making a strong commitment to be more present, because as Agi says, it is about being on the ground, it is about being around the table when the decisions are made, it is about injecting these perspectives and making sure that we can influence. I think the value of engagement is really what it's all about, and I think we are very, very serious. We're going through a very big change management to make sure we can be in more places with the right advice at the right time, without conditionality, to understand really how much we can go forward. And it is a very, very pivotal moment, I mean, I think in history, but I think we are, you know, as you can see, very well prepared, at least to keep moving and to keep it up. So thank you.
Thank you very much, all of you, and I will hand over to Felix for it.
Thank you very much, and that brings us actually not only to the closing of this panel, but to the closing of the 2024 annual conference of the Geneva Human Rights Platform. I hope you're taking away a lot of thoughts from those workshops, from the panels, from the discussions that we just heard. And I just want to end on the note that I heard here a lot of terms actually also in this panel, specifically on ethics, on equity, on dignity, on human-centric, on foundational, actually all ways to talk human rights. So I think that way of also us as a human rights community, the need to speak in the language of the addressee to bring human rights to the agencies as we hear. It's there a lot, it's there at high level, it's there also, as you say, on the ground. It might not be there always in every day-to-day work, but really I think we need to talk in this way, human rights in those languages without, of course, forgetting the obligations that come with human rights. And I hope that we contributed ideas of how to enhance cooperation and to expand human rights connectivity across the system with this. I'd like to thank you very much for your participation and interactive participation in the workshops, your attention, and thank you very much for your contributions.